I trust that some of them might still be on board online. The chair of the board of directors of the Institute, esteemed speakers, panel members, colleagues, human settlement family members. A warm welcome to all of you, and all protocol observed. I would like to just introduce us to this panel C. This panel will be exploring human settlement experiences in the developing world across 3 different continents: Latin America, Africa, and India. I've just realized that our panelist from India has indicated that he's having severe difficulties to connect, so we will not have him. But from we have also had an apology from Dr. Gambu from Kenya. So we have 3 panelists, which gives us a bit of scope to structure the panel in a slightly different way. We hope to not just learn from our panelists, but also to have them and us co-create some ideas and thoughts on dealing with our common problems in terms of human settlements. I'm therefore not going to introduce the speakers who are not here. So that is Prof. Aramarefi from India. He is not here. The first on our list on the program that I will introduce is Professor Jorge Perez. I'm going to introduce the 3 of them, and then I am going to ask, there was a little bit of confusion around exactly how it would be structured, and apologies in advance to the panelists that I'm taking a bit of poetic liberty in structuring the session. So we are having Professor Milosevic to present first, and then we will have Professor Jorge Perez, and lastly we will have a recorded presentation by Mrs. Anaclaudia Rossbach. So to first of all just introduce Professor Perez. I don't know whether it's possible to just put his image up whilst I introduce him. He's not going to present at this point, but just to, there we are. Jorge, nice to meet you. We've been communicating in the strange hours of the night. I saw his response this morning, our time at 12:44. So that's part of the excitement if you are working intercontinental. Professor Perez is an architect and urban and regional planner. He's the member of MDE Urban Lab, planning advisor to the government of Antigua, and senior consultant to the World Bank. He is a professor at Universidad Santo Tomas Medellin, Faculty of Architecture and Master in Territorial Studies. He's also a visiting professor at several universities. He has been, in amongst others, Dean and Professor of the Faculties of Architecture of the Pontificia Bolivaria and Santo Tomas Universities in Medellin. I'm not sure if my pronunciation is right, but I'm sure he'll correct it if it is too far wrong. Thanks, Timba, saying the Thomas part I got right. Visiting fellow at King's College, Cambridge in 2017. He has been teaching in courses and lectures in countries on several continents. His works of architecture and urbanism has been awarded in several competitions. National and international awards has been awarded to him. He is also the Ubuntu advisor to the executive direction of the Union of Cities and Local Governments in Barcelona. He has been on the technical committee on Guangzhou in China. He has also been a scholarship at Curitiba. He has recently published a book, Medellin, Urbanismo y Sociedad. Okay, that is Professor Jorge Perez. The next bio I will present to you is then Professor Predrag Milosevic. He was educated in Yugoslavia. He's a certified architect, urban planner, and in architecture and construction with a speciality in housing. He was the one who initiated physical planning for the Republic of Spasska and the Republic of Spasska Krajina. Again, I'm not sure of the pronunciations. Taking part in planning himself. Later, he was a lecturer and senior lecturer at the Faculty of Civil Engineering and Architecture at the University of Nice. He then became an associate professor at the National University of Science and Technology in the Faculty of Architecture, Quantity Surveying in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe. He is currently a professor teaching in numerous universities abroad and is also involved in teaching, in amongst others, traditional African and Asian architecture, innovative technologies, materials and structures, earth architecture, environment and technology, sustainable architecture, and urban planning. Currently, from my understanding from his bio, he is with the University of Botswana. Professor Milosevic, welcome also to you. Then I will briefly just put to you Anaclaudia Rossbach's very brief bio. She is the Director of Latin America and the Caribbean at the Lincoln Institute. And she says, I'm an economist with over 20 years of experience working with the subjects of precarious settlements, social housing, and urban policy. I worked at the Sao Paulo City Hall, also supported the Brazilian Ministry of Cities and the construction and implementation of the Brazilian housing policy. I founded and was in charge of the ONG Integratio, which supported the development of high-impact projects in communities in the state of Sao Paulo and Recife. As a high-level World Bank consultant, I provided technical assistance for the development and implementation of the Brazilian housing and slum upgrading policy for 10 years, including 2 major programs, slum upgrading, PAC favelas, and the housing subsidy Minha Casa, Minha Vida. Ladies and gentlemen, can we give our speakers a warm welcome from our side, even in their absence, but in their virtual presence? As you have gathered, we have a select few of the world's best with us when it comes to human settlements. And as Sipukazi noted over lunchtime, thanks to COVID, we are able to connect in this manner, and we've all become familiar with it. The way I want to structure our afternoon is that each of the presenters will have 10 minutes to present, and given that we have a few more minutes, I want to then allow a maximum of 5 minutes for the other panel members. If we've got this level of wealth of expertise, I am sure the other panel members, in fact, it's the other panel member in this case, I've just realized Anaclaudia is just a presentation, for the other panel member to ask questions, should there be. And then 5 minutes for the floor, and then we'll go to the next speaker. And when we are done, that'll take us to probably about, that'll take us to 50 minutes. Then we'll open to the floor for questions to the rest of the panel. Okay, so Professor Milosevic, if you are ready, you can present.
Oh, if you want me to present now, it's okay, I can.
Okay, yeah, we said that. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's okay with me. Just let me share my screen. Good afternoon all, and thank you all for the invitation. I'm, of course, very honored by the invitation, and my special thanks goes to first Professor Mbanga, who was very helpful in invitation, but also in all discussions I have had with him to prepare my presentation properly. I'm not going to talk a lot about my slides because there are too many. There are, as you can see, more than 150. I'm only going to tell you a little bit more about this, and throughout my talking or my speech, I'm going just to move slightly those slides so you can see. The main idea of this presentation of African traditional architecture as an integral part of indigenous knowledge systems in housing provision, that's the title of my presentation as well, is to examine an array of vernacular buildings and landscapes from the early periods to the present and consider what they can tell us about the past and potentially the present and the future as well. By vernacular, we refer to ordinary or everyday spaces and places that people encounter on the daily basis, like houses, workspaces, institutional buildings, but rarely we think about critical.
Shall we go to the other presenter and then we'll get back to Professor Milosevic? Okay, Jorge, are you ready to present? Then we'll go to you and then we'll go back to Professor Milosevic.
All right, thank you very much. As I have said, my idea is that you share the screen from there and I will only contribute with my presentation. So whenever, okay, fine, thank you very much. I'm really, really glad to participate in this panel. Thank you for this very, very kind invitation. I've been struggling to be connected to South Africa in several times, and I'm sorry, but the last 2 times I was unable to visit your country. So hopefully this will be one of many future collaborations from our cities and our regions. As you all know, housing is a very, very challenging and priority for the world. Planning as a collective agenda is my first contribution. I might say that we must understand the problems of housing, not only from housing agenda. I think it is needed to understand that SDGs and climate change challenges, the problems of inequality and extreme poverty, of health and other problems needs to be addressed from a planning perspective. So one statement that it's basic from my point of view is that we need to combine simultaneously planning matters with housing development problems. Some basic statements from Medellin experience, very complex experiences, searching for integral solutions are the guidelines of my presentations. As you all know, in Medellin, it's been very traditional, the success of low-scale interventions. The name of that is social urbanismo social. But my statement means that we also need, together with those acupuncture interventions, strategic solutions. So we need a housing construction policy instead of a social housing policy. That's different because in Colombia, we have, as many countries like yours, a policy to support construction. But we need to have a social housing policy, integral, that is basically concerned about the right to the city and the right to the housing. So, as I have said, we need to go from social urbanism to strategic social urbanism planning, combining upgrading barrios with strategic habitat-oriented development. Habitat-oriented development should be, like transit-oriented development, a global policy for all, because we need to have inclusion, affordability, and quality simultaneously addressed. And we need to talk about complete cities for all, because what is happening globally is that many of the projects that have been built are creating incomplete cities, because most of the policies are segregating communities to the peripheral areas of the city. Next, please. In these, sorry, in these images, next, please. In these images, you can see another view of Medellin. Medellin is located in a very narrow valley, like a canyon, in the Cordillera de los Andes, 1,500 meters above the sea level. It's a very important city in Colombia, it's the second largest one. And it's famous because of its problematic urbanization process and the conflicts that we have overcome along the last decades. But as you see in these images, the city has been growing on top of the mountains in a very unsustainable way, providing only a few solutions for the majority of the communities. And these informal settlements have been growing over risky areas. And if you see on the left bottom picture, you will see that in the base of the river area, which is the flat area of the river, you have low densities and the potential of transformation of the city inside. So in the next slide, you will see the challenge of inclusive development through planning processes. We have been searching for a compact city, growing inwards with a strategy for regeneration and harmony with the natural system. And the regeneration problems means to reconnect the city with its river, the city with the environment, but also providing accessibility for all and promoting the guarantee of the right to the city for all. Because traditionally, as I have been said, the only option for the stream pool communities is to be located on the hills, on top of the mountains, segregated in the peripheral areas. So our challenge is to find ways, innovative ways, to stop growing over the strategic ecosystems in the upper mountains. Segregation and peripheral urbanism must not be our way of developing. So if you look on the drawing that I'm showing you, you see the metropolitan valley, and on top you see a section of that valley. In the red color points, you see the traditionally way of growing of Medellin. But if you look at the bottom side in black color of the drawing, you see that we are promoting to have higher densities inside the city, close to the river areas, to promote a more compact and integrated city that will provide us the chance to, next please, to protect the borders, to create a green belt, to have a green strategy with ecological main structure, to preserve the quality, the environmental quality, but also to fight against risks and also promote inclusivity with social equity in harmony with the strategic ecosystems and nature. And that strategy shows in this drawing on the right. What is happening is that we are promoting in the center of the city, surrounding the river, the new agenda for urban redevelopment in Medellin. Next, please. And that means that our tradition, if you see these graphics that shows the diagnosis of our evolution, it's been on the left side, you see the white color areas that were regulated with zero density for housing purposes along the years. So if you look on the right, the darker colors shows where the housing policies have been prevailing. So the challenge in the next slide is to have another approach to the future for the housing affordable development, affordable housing development. That means to have what I call habitat-oriented strategy with strategic intervention projects inside the river area. That means compact city, that means growing inwards, that means regeneration and harmony with the natural system. So in the next slide, you see also how can we fund that? How can we promote a different way of developing these urban areas? The proposal means that along the river, there are opportunity for 120,000 new homes of urban redevelopment projects. And that means also that we are using financing the city and the social affordable housing policy through land revenue sharing. So in the right side on the bottom, you see how the city is organized to capture value from the land. And in the inner area, close to the river, the opportunity is that we can have, as I have said, 120,000 new homes, and 20% of those homes by the regulations has to be affordable houses supported by the real estate sector projects. And in the next slides, you see some of the projects on the left that are under construction now. In that project, a private group of companies that are developing real estate businesses, they are building 1,000 new apartments. And in the basement of the building, the conceptual design means that the affordable houses are located on the basis of the building. And on these 4 towers, they will have the rental, the business for the other kind of homes. So they have 20% affordable housing and 80% businesses. And that means that these will provide the opportunity for the people to be connected to the city inside, a walkable connectivity with the metro system in front of the buildings. They will have connection to the river. In the future, there will be a park. They have the zoo and some of the parks close to the place. But if you look at our tradition, on the right side, you see the informal settlements on top of the mountain. You see how we have built cable cars and so on to try to support those communities. But if you look on the left, you will have that all the people, all the communities will have accessibility for the same city. So to end the last part of my presentation, we'll say some statements. Next, the first thing I would like to say is that the market is not enough. We demand strong leadership by the local governments and stakeholders. I think it's needed to prioritize enough the obligation that we have to support through a housing affordable policy, the construction of these kinds of projects. We cannot only keep on doing upgrading barrios on the peripheral areas. So, meaning that the communities not only need houses or homes, they need public life. That's a priority. So planning is not a privilege. Collective planning to protect life and to coexist with nature is a basic right for everyone in our cities. Sorry. So complete cities for equity, justice, and health with proximity urbanism is fundamental. So this concept of integration against segregation means urbanism. The segregation is also a procedure that is related to the way we expand, we explore our cities, and we build our homes on the peripheral areas. So on the next slide to end, I will show you how the river area is being developed the last years. So because we only think that the connection between housing, affordable housing, public spaces, and the general concept model of the city planning is the complete system to create a better city. So urban regeneration must be an opportunity to also create new homes, not only better infrastructures, better public spaces, and better civic areas. We need also to include housing there. Next, please. So this picture, it's amazing for me because one of the things that is traditional in Medellin is planning. We started to develop this new civic hall from a plan in 1950, and in the 1970s, we started to build these. So on the left side, you see the government, the civic hall of Medellin. But in this picture, I will not explain all the details, but you can see that in the last 25 years, we have built like 8 to 9 civic buildings and new public spaces that are integrating the traditional downtown to the barrios on the right side. So the river was the last challenge. How can we transform the river into an ecosystem for life? So the sanitation process, the mobility systems, infrastructures through underground components, and then the creation of a park and pedestrian and bike lanes, non-motorized mobility systems to connect the city for all. Okay. Next, please. So in this
Professor, we're going to have to stop you at this point.
I will end now. In this last picture, you will see the image of our model for the future of Medellin. This landscape must belong to all. This must be a city for life. This must be a healthy city. And you can create that through integration of equity, inclusivity, together with public policies for affordable housing development. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I just check, is Professor Milosevic back online?
I'm back.
You're back.
I'm not very aware what happened in the meantime.
Okay.
Some internet disconnection must be. So okay. I can start once again. Would you please move my slides one by one from that side, or am I supposed to move them?
I don't know. Technical team, can you move just a minute? Any questions in the meanwhile? Professor Milosevic, we said initially, could you hear Jorge's presentation, and have you got any questions to ask him whilst we're getting our technical act together?
Yeah, to Jorge, you mean?
Yeah. Has Professor Milosevic got a question for Professor Perez?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I have seen some examples from Spain. I'm not very aware of the design studio name. It may be Madrid, Rio, or something like that. They're excellent. They did lots of these river embankments designs recently. And the most famous to me, of course, is the one in Madrid itself. That one is very excellent. I have seen it many times visiting Madrid, and I really enjoy it. It's a very professional level. And this Medellin, Colombia case study reminds me to that Madrid case. I really believe that's the way we should try to reconnect waters, greeneries, forests, and so on within our cities for best or better living condition, at least for us, and especially now under these climate issues all the way around. So that's it. So thank you for this. If you can just move them, there are lots of them, 150 and something, just move them 2 or 3 seconds each. Not so very fast, but 2 or 3 seconds. I'm not going to read through them because there are too many. I'm just going to read a little bit here. And of course, I will be ready to answer to questions and comments later. So let me just start once again. The presentation, African Traditional Architecture as an Integral Part of Indigenous Knowledge Systems in Housing Provision. It's to examine an array of vernacular buildings and landscapes from the early period to the present across the continent, and consider what they can tell us about the past and potentially the present and the future as well. By vernacular, we refer to ordinary or everyday spaces and places that people encounter on the daily basis, like houses, workspaces, institutional buildings. But rarely we think about it critically, because these environments often were and still are ordinary for us. That means not high style, not designed by architects, then by the people, by the traditional ways of thinking, landscape architects, professional designers, and so on. Traditional art historical frameworks that focus on stylistic categories or makers' biographies prove rather ineffective in interpreting them, which means we are in a way humiliating the tradition on each and every continent, in each and every country across the globe. Africa is not the exemption of that rule. And the tradition is actually very, very essential, because the generation of the peoples are the best to be asked and to answer to all proper questions of sustainable architecture and urban planning even today. And that will be the same in the future as well. So The presentation thus looks at the certain recent works by architects looking to the fields of anthropology, history, vernacular studies, cultural geography, landscape architecture and history, folklore, material culture to construct frameworks that help us understand the significance, cultural and economic, but other as well, that vernacular environments have had for their makers and users. You have seen in the earlier slides how African architecture is actually very mathematical, which means a huge minds are actually behind the tradition of African architecture. I'm not talking about tens of the thousands of years. It must be hundreds of thousands of years. Even in this picture, you can see the mathematics is speaking to us all. It's not a simple tradition or the way we are using materials, technologies, construction, and so on, but the essence of the mathematics, what we call today fractal or fractals, is very extant and very visible in all African examples in architecture, all around the continent, from the west to the east and from the north to the south. Let me now continue a little bit more. There is not so much to say except to see the slides and listen to a little bit more comments of myself. There are several interrelated objectives for this presentation, some descriptive and some are interpretative. It is obvious that vernacular buildings and landscapes often deviate significantly from the high style or architects' designed examples in their style, materials, typology, and or method of construction. This doesn't mean these spaces are necessarily inferior to more famous designed examples. They are just different, very different, and if you ask me, much better. You can see here, that's a lot of excitement, but again, it's a lot of sustainability and a lot of mathematics, which comes from the human mind long, very long ago. And Africa is probably the best examples of the traditions that are still living and breathing in front of us all. That's why Africa is probably the most useful example for the sustainability in architecture and urban planning for all the planet, even today. And it will, I'm sure, stay for long that way. So furthermore, understanding these buildings as historical and cultural evidence necessitates that we think of them in ways beyond their style and or makers' biographies. Thus, a major goal of this presentation is to acquire a working vocabulary that can help describe vernacular buildings and landscape in meaningful ways. Learning appropriate terminology will help recognize and understand vernacular environments in a way that doesn't judge them relative to high style. There is actually nothing very fruitful in making comparison in between traditional vernacular and so-called high style architecture, because if you can see, this one is an African example from Burkina Faso, famous Francis Kéré, an African architect. I have only his examples here in my presentation throughout the slides, but I could have used examples from Norman Foster's designs, which are also very, very sustainable, but in a way, very traditional, very vernacular. We can say even very African in a way. Just go to the Parliament of Wales in Cardiff. That's one of the most famous examples of Foster's work for all of us. So learning appropriate terminology will help us recognize and understand vernacular and in a way that doesn't judge them relative to high style architecture or landscapes and allows us to see them as complex forms of historical evidence, but substantial for our sustainable futures as well. That's the few words or passage I wanted to tell you here directly. The rest is for discussion, for the discussion later. If any questions arise, you can see in the presentation. Just go straight away, please. 2 seconds per each. So examples are all from across the continent. They are very different in materials, in expressions, but they are very smart, very mathematical. Once again, very mathematical, very fractal, all of them, very modern. That means too, and very useful for us even today. Some of those slides are very, very exciting, I hope not only to me. So the modern examples are all from the Francis Perez studio, his designs, like this national park building in Mali. We can continue till 10 minutes expire. Lots of slides are there. You can make them a little bit faster if you want. In Libya, in Sudan, they are very different, but fantastic altogether. Again, in Libya, so traditions are different, of course, very African, indigenous, but some of them are changed by the Christianity or by Islam, but they are all deeply rooted in the grounds of Africa, in the solutions from the previous past. And nobody can stay untouched by, seeing such a smart, such a clever solution all around the continent, which means there is a lot to be learned from them. That's in the Yellowstone National Park in the US, but an African example as well.
Okay.
Taking from the African tradition.
Yeah, Milosevic, I'm going to ask if Professor Perez has got a question for you perhaps, or a comment to make. Jorge, have you got a question or comment? Are you still with us?
Hi, yeah. One thing I would like to hear from Professor is, what do you think about this idea, this challenge of having non-European centric approach to the problems of Latin America and South Africa? Because our challenge is to learn from ourselves and from our traditions. And as you said, the experience of people like Perez is really important. But my question would be how, as we have done somehow in Medellin, we can learn from the knowledge and the great experiences from Europe, but also to create local knowledge that includes the traditions and the indigenous knowledge that the communities already have. How we can combine both things?
The trouble is only one, and it's a very simple one. We are too much, actually we are relying too much on the Western examples. And if you can just go a little step far away from this, then you can discover a lot of the areas that are very free to be exploited. And those areas are in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in Australia as well. So the indigenous examples of architecture and urban planning are very useful. The habits are the only one problem we have. That's the habit. At first, we are going to try to find solutions nearby us, which is nearby the textbooks. And the textbooks in architecture and urban planning are mostly written by the Europeans, or at least Western authors. But if you go to find the very proper, excellent examples, let's say in the history of modern architecture, then you go first to Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright was the one who was very involved in Japanese, which means Asian, in African, in also Central American architecture. The majority of his designs are developed along the guidelines of traditional architecture from the different continents, not from the West. I have already mentioned Norman Foster. His most prominent examples are also not from the West. The technologies or the sustainability issues in Foster's designs, in Perez designs also. One of them is British, another one of them is from Burkina Faso. They are both developing their designs along proper examples that are emanating not from the West, then from the tradition, from vernacular architecture, which is mostly clearly visible in some different continents than Europe or North America. So that's why I already said Africa is a very proper place, and of course Central and Latin America and some parts of Asia to be the central points of our attention, because we have examples to be very useful right in front of our eyes, all across the so-called undeveloped world, or across the global south. Global south, as we call it, is a very prominent area in that sense. So I think it's the trouble is only in habits. The habits are bad. We have to change habits.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I would like to complement this good statement from you with my idea that we need complete cities, because the challenge of affordable housing must also be conscious that we need to have better cities with inclusivity, with public spaces, with new parks, with transportation, everything together with integral solutions.
Yeah. True.
I think we all agree on that. So it's nothing new.
Okay, gents, can I stop you there and let's have a look at, we started 20 minutes late, so am we okay? Are we okay to have Anaclaudia's presentation and still have some questions from the floor after that? Who do I look to? Okay, thank you, Program Director and Chair. Can we have Anaclaudia's presentation on? Whilst they're getting that, are there questions from the floor?
All right, good afternoon. My name is Kanya Tsagata. I'm an architect and a Chief Building Control Officer from Gouga Municipality. I just want to perhaps comment and at the same time ask questions, particularly relating to Professor Milosevic's presentation. The first part is really a comment. And the comment is, I'm really suspicious of what the term African, when it tries to classify or categorize certain things. In particular, the word African architecture is problematic to me in a lot of ways because it is very reductionist in its way of classifying what is oftentimes romanticized as African architecture. The examples that were shown, particularly, I'll make reference to the Mosque of Jenny in Mali that looks at mud bricks and mud buildings. Now, I think that there was a historical context for that, but that context cannot be construed as an identity. The reason I say that is that the mosque in Jenny was suitable for a certain time, but with the advent of climate change, even that building is now a case study in how ineffective mud structures can be with reduced rainfalls, which is characterizing West Africa right now. And thus it defeats the whole purpose of this sort of idealism that says we should return to a sort of African architecture. I think the word vernacular is important in this context because vernacular talks about a location where it's from. But if we were to stretch the word vernacular, metal was discovered in Africa. So to reduce African architecture to mud structures is actually disingenuous in that it limits it to a romanticized version, a Eurocentric version, by the way, of what African architecture is or was. Really what it is, that is an African motif of what people think African architecture is. Now the question is, how do you then reconcile? How do you reconcile this disparity of what mainly Western architecture teaches us is African architecture with the actual realities of what locally available materials are there in Africa? I've just mentioned metal as one of them, but every single one of the resources that is used to build European architecture is actually African in its origin. So if Professor Milosevic can comment on that, I would be very, very grateful. Thank you.
Okay, your question is taken. I believe Anaclaudia's presentation is ready, so let us have a look at that and then we can give Professor Milosevic an opportunity to respond to your comment. Thank you very much. Yeah. No, we're not taking any further questions from the floor right now. We'll return to the floor. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Anaclaudia Rossbach. I'm the Director for Latin America and the Caribbean for the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I am very glad to be here with you today. Unfortunately, not online because I'm speaking to you from Santiago in Chile. I've prepared a presentation today share with you lessons from Latin America some lessons, some challenges, and some perspectives that we face here in the region in relation to low-income housing and informal settlements. This is the structure of the presentation. I will talk a little bit about the context, about the challenges of urban expansion in Latin America, the impact of COVID, the structural challenges that we face, and how ready we are for an urban transformation to promote the change. So first of all, the context in Latin America, we have observed since the 90s stabilization in demographic growth. The urbanization process in most countries of Latin America has achieved a kind of stable status, and there's a change in the household composition. So we have today a different demand for low-income housing, than we had in the 90s or in the early 2000s. But we still have structural challenges that we haven't faced yet, that we haven't overcome yet. For instance, the persistence of urban informality. And here in Latin America, the informality of labor is very prevalent. We have 50% of the economy is informal. And all the countries, and especially after COVID, are facing actually a structural or chronic macroeconomic instability. And it's visible that there's an overlap, there's an intersection among environmental and social vulnerability that's triggered by the climate change crisis. And clearly, the Latin American model of social housing has achieved a limit. And although we have progressive legal frameworks, we still face challenges in terms of implementation. So the Americas have expanded amazingly fast from the 50s to until 2018. So in Latin America specifically, we increased the urbanization rate from 41% to 81%. But in the last, let's say, 20 years, the urban expansion, the spatial expansion has been close to European rates, as a matter of fact, right? So it's not that our cities grew more than the rest of the world. We are more or less close to other regions of the world. But what happens in the region is that what we grow in terms of cities of urban is informal. So worldwide, what we have observed, or as Shlomo Angel has observed, is that 3/4 of the growth of the cities happen off the city, outside of the city, with a 60% lower density. Latin America was the same. So cities grew led by private developers or by informal settlements, right? But in case of informal settlements, these grow also fulfill a social function in terms of offering a shelter for migrants, for rural migrants, or for migrants from other cities, other parts of the region, to be in the city, to integrate in the city, and to enjoy the right and the opportunities in the city. So I will share with you now some of the challenges that were identified at a recent housing forum promoted by the IDB right now in August. So what we realized in this forum, in the presence with ministers and key stakeholders of Latin America, is that 90% of the investment in housing in the last 20 years has been addressed to new houses, right? Although the largest percentage, 94% of the housing deficit is qualitative. So meaning that we have built houses when our problem is to improve existing houses. And clearly, and it's a large consensus in the region, that our housing model of large-scale, low-density housing projects located in the periphery and outskirts part of the cities, it's an exclusionary model, right? It has generated segregation. And it's not generated social conflicts, violence, etc. Right? So this is the type of housing policies that we have implemented in Latin America. You see countries like Mexico, Brazil, Chile that have implemented massive housing programs. In the case of Mexico, you have some pictures here. 7 million houses were built from the 90s until the 2000s. There are some exceptions, some nice projects like this one. In the case of Brazil, 5 million houses, and you see the same patterns, you know, low density outside of the city. On the other hand, COVID has affected Latin America extremely compared to the rest of the world. So we have the highest number of reported deaths. We are facing a setback of 12 years acknowledged by the UN Economic Commission, a setback of 12 years in poverty and 20 years in extreme poverty. So we have expanded the number of people living, you know, in vulnerable territories, in vulnerable situations in our cities. On the other hand, we have examples of solidarity of NGOs, CBOs coming together and facing the challenges of pandemic. So I think the local governments and national governments, they realized that especially informal settlements, they couldn't operate, they couldn't monitor, they couldn't address the challenges of the pandemic if not in solidarity, in cooperation with community-based organizations, with NGOs. There were also regional movements like this Decalogue for Participatory Slum Upgrading. A couple of organizations came together to come out with, you know, 10 key messages to guide Islam upgrading, to guide the integration of informal settlements in the region. That has to do with embedding informality in territorial planning, in the public policy, in improving governance, in improving infrastructure, but also recognizing social diversity, the political recognition, dialogue, recognizing the memory, the solidarity in economy, and the climate justice. In Latin America, we have at least 20% of the population living in informal settlements, 120 million people living in informal settlements. As I said before, the qualitative deficit is much higher than the quantitative deficit, but we don't have policies to address this deficit yet. We are still struggling with that. We have structural challenges in terms of access of land, in terms of income inequalities that we haven't addressed. And in terms of informality, there's this publication from the IDB. We still don't know the real number. So the IDB made a survey in the 23 countries trying to identify how census were fit to understand the numbers of people living in informal settlements. And what we understand is that we are not fit. We don't have a common concept, and we don't know the real numbers of people living on informality. And this created a large market of informal land. There are some reasons for that. So in relation of affordability, in relation of, you know, the existence of vacant land, unoccupied land in the city, and in the absence of proper housing policies, in the prevalence of income inequalities, people end up squatting in informal land, right? And in city centers, intensification and informal divisions. And the cities were not able to cope with that. Cities are not equipped to plan with and for informal settlements. We barely see cities that are equipped to map the informal settlements, to embed informality in the planning, to create design regulations that don't exclude but include informal settlements, and most important, to reserve areas for affordable housing. If you're not able to reserve land in the city for affordable housing, where the subsidies given by the national governments can be allocated in the territory, we'll see continuously this expansion of informal settlements. And we also have the challenge of the price of the land. Well-located land is very expensive, so this requires high level of subsidies and a fiscal capacity that our countries are challenging to cope cope with, right? So as I said before, we have two main challenges, I would say. One is deep economic and social inequalities, structural issues that we urban planners, we people from housing, we cannot address, but we can address access to well-located land, right? We can address that through regulations, through earmarking zoning and areas for social housing, and regulations that will enable slum upgrading, integration of slums in the cities, improving of infrastructure in slums in the cities, right? So in the case of Latin America, how ready we are, you know, we are still far of being ready to at least monitor SDG 11, that is the SDG related to informal settlements in cities, because as I said, census are not equipped to understand this data, this information. And we don't have a comprehensive record of informal areas. We have examples of organizations that are mapping informal settlements, but this is fragmented yet. It's not comprehensive, right? At the regional level, we don't have a standard. We do have a common denominator related to these elements: wall, floor, ceiling materials, overcrowding, provision of basic services like energy, water, and sanitation, but that's it. We don't have much information about the informality of land, the status of land, etc., right? So what's the way forward? So how can we move forward from that? So we really need to keep promoting innovation, understanding what's going on in different countries, different experiences, different cities, promote the exchange of these informations, investing in knowledge, and then promote systemic changes to deliver long-term results, right? So we have excellent experiences in the region. So this is a case of integrated slum upgrading in Rio de Janeiro. We have the classic example of Medellin. What we don't have is beyond projects. We don't have the systemic changes. And there is where we need to invest right now in Latin America. And I believe many countries from the global south in information, understand the levels of informality, understand how markets, formal and informal markets work, to improve our frameworks, to make our legal frameworks to be fit to embed informal settlements in the planning of the cities, to for the provision of infrastructure, the money that comes from the federal government, investments that come from different levels, from the private sector, are directed to these informal and deprived and vulnerable areas in the cities. And we have to invest in institutional arrangements and participatory governance. So we have to overcome asymmetries of information. We have to understand the level of informality. We have to expand our financial system, invest in microfinance institutions, cooperatives, to work, improving and strengthening small and medium enterprise that are operating, that are providing home improvements and small infrastructure improvements in informal settlements. And we have to look at sustainability, right? So I believe in Latin America, we have advanced a lot. We have a large trajectory. We have strong institutions, policies, arrangements. We have cities that are fit to plan and to integrate informal settlements and to consider that. We still have to invest more in the systemic transformation. And the way for that to happen is through collaboration and co-creation. There's no way that one single government, being national, local government, can operate alone, can identify the solutions alone, can co-create, can design the solutions alone. So we need to have a multidisciplinary view, perspective, but also a multi-sectorial perspective. So we really need to work together to collect the different pieces of the puzzles together to understand what the private sector can offer, what the social sector can offer, what the different levels of government can offer, right, from the different sectors, to really work towards systemic transformations, and with that, the transformation of informal settlements. We have seen that in Brazil, in Colombia, in some countries in Latin America, but we still have a long way to go. So this is a short view, a panorama of what is our trajectory in Latin America, what's the context right now, especially after COVID, and the dangers that we are, in terms of moving back and expanding informality. But we also see that the responses of COVID are very oriented towards collaboration and co-creation, and this can be a clue for us to see how we should work among sectors, among governments, and promote more radical transformation. Thank you very much.
Colleagues, we are at the end of our session. This gentleman over here had a question. Do you still have your question? I'm not going to allow any others. It was just because he was upfront in wanting to ask a question. Yep, you're done. You're okay. You're covered. Okay, then we're going to, in closure, give Professor Milosevic an opportunity to respond to the question he had and also give a concluding remark. And thereafter, we'll ask Professor Perez to also just make a concluding remark. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's not very difficult to answer. First, we are to think that we are all humans. Just then, I'm European in a way, but I'm also African in a way, and Asian and American, I mean, even Central American in a way. My background is very Serbian, is very European, but I'm never thinking about myself so much European and Serbian, and much more than as human. If you go to Istanbul, let's say, you will see a lot of different things from the centuries or millennia back before in history. Standing on the bridge in between Asia and Europe, you are not very aware what is the difference in between Europe and Asia. The stories can go on and on and on, but there is no essence in that issue. So Africa is one of the continents. Europe is another, Asia is the third one, and so on. Africa is the continent where the traditions are very, very preserved, and that's the issue here. Those traditions are originally emanating, of course, from Africa itself, not so much from Asia and let alone Europe. Those are human traditions first. Just then, those are African traditions. So if I'm talking about African, I'm always thinking human first. So human mathematics, human sustainability, human vernacular, and just then African. I hope this helps. Mali, Janneh Mosque is only one of the slides I have in my presentations, which contains more than, I believe, 400 examples all across African continent. The system of building that mosque is the one I'm appreciating very much. There is, of course, a lot of European influences in this, in the layout, in the disposal of some or certain elements within the mosque, but the traditional ways of using materials and traditions in these technologies of architecture are the ones I'm appreciating very much and recommending for the further use. So not only the layout or the function and the traditions in using materials of these vernacular solutions. That's what I hope answers to the question. So we are all a civilization that is very mixed, but we are to be aware of the roots of our civilization that, as far as we know, emanates from Africa. That's first. And the name of Africa, we are all very aware where is that name coming from, which is, of course, of very, very secondary importance in this issue. We are also aware of the name of Europe. Where is that coming from? Where is the name of Asia coming from? So we are to use terms only conditionally. Terms like Europe, like, African, and so on. Humanities first. I hope this answers.
Thank you. Professor Perez, would you like to give us a closing remark?
No, just thank you for the invitation and insist on the concept that housing and human settlements must be a priority. Also, my idea related to the necessity of a stronger leadership from local governments in order to achieve the SDGs and the climate change agenda. Otherwise, I think the national governments, the nations, are not enough in their capacity to support the community. So this community challenge must be addressed together simultaneously in a multi-level agenda, but also in a multi-scale planning and urban development proposal. Thank you for this very kind invitation and hope that this seminar will be successful all the way down. Thank you so much.
Let's give our panelists a hand. And I took note of what Professor Perez said, and I think it applies equally well to the other panelists. Now that we've made contact, we are going to retain the contact and mine your knowledge. We are going to invite you for guest lectures and visits if you so wish, but I think we will start with guest lectures to share the wealth of your knowledge with some of our students. Thank you very much from our side. Had you been with us on stage, we would have been able to either give you an indigenous or a colonial or a collaborative gift. But now we can only give you a hand and say thank you so much.